Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Library of Congress. My name is David Morris. I'm the German area specialist in the European division here. And I want to welcome you to an evening with Frido Mann, who will be lecturing on will be giving a presentation entitled Democracy Will Win. Rather optimistic title, I think, but we'll see about that. We're looking forward to his reasons for his title. I would like, first of all, to thank our co-sponsors, the Goethe Institute, who have been invaluable in helping us put this on, and the Wunderbar Together initiative of the German Foreign Office. A few technical things. As you can probably tell, we are recording this for broadcast on our website, so please silence your cell phones. And also, Frido has kindly agreed after his presentation to entertain some questions. And there are mics, as you can see, for that here. Now, in a moment, I'm going to hand over the podium to Andreas Ströll, the director of the Goethe Institute. But before that, I would like to say a few words about the legacy of the German language in this institution. The German collections, the German language accounts for more items in the library than any other language except English. That means 4 million books, another 4 million non-book items in other formats such as maps, music, etc. And we get another 30,000 items every year. So that makes it really the largest German language collection in the world outside of Europe. But it was not always like that. If you go across this building and take a look at Thomas Jefferson's private collection, one of the cornerstones of this institution, you would be hard-pressed to find more than a scant handful of German titles amid the 6,000, 7,000 titles that are there. It wasn't actually until after the Civil War and into the 20th century that the German language came into its own here and became a real focus of our collecting. And this was due in no small part to the appointment in December 1941, right after the United States entered World War II, of our first specialist in German language materials, and that man was none other than the grandfather of our speaker today, Thomas Mann. Thomas's formal title was Consultant in Germanic Literature, and he remained here in that capacity until about 1945. But because of his time here, LC has, fortunately, a collection of Thomas Mann papers, including a handwritten draft on Library of Congress stationery of his short story Das Gesetz, which he dedicated to this institution, and drafts of 3 speeches that he delivered here between 1942 and 1947. In fact, Frido and I, before we came here, were able to look at a number of these materials thanks to the staff who made that possible in our manuscript division. Now, sadly, Thomas Mann's time in the U.S. was marred in his later years here by the rabid anti-communism of the McCarthy era, in which he found himself often a target. One of the early lectures he gave on his own tour of the U.S. and North America in 1938 echoes, in fact, the topic of Frido's speech today, the coming victory of democracy. The FBI criticized this speech as strongly radical and strongly pro-USSR. By the late 1940s, Thomas, I think it's fair to say, no longer really recognized the freedom-loving country he had grown to admire, but he did remain a fellow of the library until his death. Now, I don't want to leave you with that perhaps somewhat bitter aftertaste. Just let me say, I prefer to see Thomas Mann's time here at this institution and Frido Mann's presence today as representing the best of Germany, the best of America, and a form of cultural interaction with deeper roots than daily politics. Frido Mann, among the many steps in your tour throughout North America, I see your presence here today as somewhat of a family affair and a return to the cultural relationship your grandfather did so much to nurture. Welcome. And now here to introduce our speaker is Andreas Ströll, the director of the Goethe Institute of North America. Andreas.
Thank you, David. My name is Andreas Ströll. As David just said, I'm the director of the Goethe Institutes in North America, including Washington, of course. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Frido Mann to you this evening. We're doing this in cooperation with the European or the German division of the Library of Congress and the Villa Aurora Thomas Mann House in Pacific Palisades. While many of you may be familiar with, I guess all of you are familiar with Frido Mann's family, especially, of course, with Thomas Mann, Heinrich Mann. Frido has made quite a name for himself as a public intellectual, and he was born in Monterey, California, in 1940. His family had fled from Germany and lived in exile in a very robust community of German intellectuals along the California coast, which included, of course, Thomas Mann, but also Theodor Adorno, Bertolt Brecht, many other intellectual immigrants from Germany, filmmakers too, screenwriters. And they actually met. They are in Brecht's Arbeitsjournal you find, and in other diaries you find all these notes. How, for instance, Brecht makes fun of Adorno and the other way around and so on. Anyway, so there was this cohesion between those people, but with the rise of McCarthyism in post-war America, the Mann family left for Europe, in a way fleeing persecution again, left for good. Traveling between Europe and the United States in his youth, Frido Mann studied and earned degrees in all kinds of fields, in music, in theology, in psychology, and he worked for many years as a clinical psychologist in Münster, Leipzig, and Prague. And Prague is actually where we first met. We just realized it's a quarter century ago, or more than that even, in the early 90s, when he came to the Goethe Institute in Prague, and I was there at the beginning of my career with the Goethe Institute. I can still recall the conversation we had on Theresienstadt, the concentration camp, and especially on the children's drawings and paintings that came from there. And Frido Mann actually wrote a book about that too. So I'm very happy to see him again. He's totally unchanged. It's amazing after this long time. He now lives in Munich as a writer of, among other things, novels about his family, psychology, religion, essays on politics. Politics, one must say, in an age of global crisis, in another age of global crisis. He's also an active blogger. I found that very interesting and amazing. In his writings about his family's time in exile, Professor Mann has recalled the political commitment of his grandfather, and these memories have made him ever more committed to the question of what influence open dialogue can produce today. And he's trying to live that kind of dialogue. So he's also a fellow at the Thomas Mann House. That's the Mann's family home that Thomas Mann had built in Pacific Palisades. And it is now owned by the German government, and we work very closely with them, the Goethe Institute, and actually it's a Goethe colleague who runs the house. The whole concept is also based on dialogue. And I've been told that, and we just talked about that Frido Mann spent a lot of time at a school yesterday and trying to listen and to learn from those kids and make them think about democracy and what it takes to preserve it. So dialogue is very much at the core of his thinking, and with his speech today, titled Democracy Will Win. Professor Mann is following in the footsteps of his grandfather, who over 80 years ago addressed American audience with his famous speech, The Coming Victory of Democracy. David just mentioned that. That was broadcast throughout the US as an attempt to rally support in America for fighting the Nazi regime. Something, by the way, that a lot of Germans never forgave him. It's that's another thing that should be discussed. We welcome Professor Mann and his hopeful and enthusiastic support for democracy today. Thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you very much, David and Andreas, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad that and thank you that you came, and I'm very moved, even and honored, great honor that I will speak today to you in this house, where decades before, 80 years ago, Thomas Mann was himself speaking here too. So this is a great moment for me. And today I will talk to you about the power, the dignity, the importance of dialogue, of open dialogue, as was already been mentioned, as a pathway of fortification of democracy, which is very important. But I will underline my thoughts with many autobiographical facts from myself too, but especially also from the Mann family, the political life of the Mann family. And this will be the topic, and I just can begin with my speech. Democracy will win. It is not supposed to be a really optimistic. I think it's more as an expression of struggle. Already at an early age, as a child born in the US, I could feel at first atmospherically, but later more and more consciously, as a boy, the deep democratic conviction of my parents and grandparents. In their American exile, they had soon adopted the basic nature of the American Constitution from 1787, the oldest one in the world. The first words of its preamble had quickly become ingrained: we, the people of the United States. It was not about our nation or our country, not about some super-individual, ideologically abstract, hierarchically ordered stately entity demanding obedience and submission, and even less about an ethnic community. At its center, instead, was the free union of free individual people. We, the people. In 1933, my family had left the worst people's community that ever existed, Germany under National Socialism, and had emigrated from Europe to the USA time before the eruption of the Second World War. A few years later, they became American citizens. Towards the end of the Second World War, their political conviction was slowly transferred also to me more and more consciously. My grandparents' house was a host to many co-emigres, writers and musicians especially. Early on, I could sense the consternation at the perversions of human rights and the great cultural tradition of their abandoned homeland. I myself had always been filled with a proud sense of community at the primary school in Mill Valley, San Francisco, where my parents lived, when my class had to sing the national anthem every morning before school started. We were standing en bloc before the more than head-high American flag next to the teacher's desk, boys saluting, girls with their hands of their hearts. Democracy, for us Americans, constitutionally established, was for me, from the beginning, the emblem of civil autonomy. It stood for freedom of opinion and co-determination on the basis of a fundamentally equal status of all people. As an adult, I understand this social, political, and legal signification increasingly as an expression of an even deeper conviction. It is based on the philosophy of enlightenment and our Jewish-Christian concept of humanity. It was the basic understanding of an indiscriminate equivalence of all humans. For that reason, the concept of democracy remains first and foremost sustained by the awareness of human dignity. This is also how it was put in 1938 in the passionate address to the American people by author and Nobel Literature Laureate Thomas Mann. The title, as already had been mentioned, The Coming Victory of Democracy. There he writes, "We must define democracy as that form of government and society which is inspired above every other with the feeling and consciousness of the dignity of man." It is reminiscent of the great American thinker and poet Walt Whitman, whom Thomas Mann studied intensively. One of his most important, Whitman's most important statements was, "For I say, at the core of democracy, finally, is the religious element. All the religions, old and new, are there or elsewhere. And topping democracy, this most alluring record that it alone can bind and ever seeks to bind all nations, all men of however various and distant lands into a brotherhood, a family." Thomas Mann penned his speech, The Coming Victory of Democracy, in the spirit of his contemporary political and humanist role model, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And he never tired of presenting his speech on a lecture tour from coast to coast, lasting several months. For Thomas Mann, this democratic conviction was not too innate, especially during World War I. He still drew a clear line between himself, a committed monarchist with nationalistic notes, and the Western democracies. But this changed after the end of monarchy. Already in 1922, in his speech Von Deutscher Republik, the German Republic, he pledged himself to the new governmental structure and found in it the formula for democracy. So he's saying, "The state has become the concern of all of us. We are the state." 1922. Soon, Thomas Mann had to watch powerlessly how the first attempt of democracy in Germany, the Weimar Republic, slowly fell apart and eventually plummeted into national socialism. In America, he began a rhetorical campaign for democracy in the 1930s, while still at Princeton, in which he considered which political system was most suitable for contemporary humanity. It is likely that his personal encounters with President Roosevelt at the White House, which made a great impression on him, contributed to this. The Californian Pacific Palisades, Los Angeles, Thomas Mann addressed his fellow Germans between 1940 and 1945 over the air through the emphatic 55 radio speeches, Listen Germany, Deutsche Hörer. In them, he implored them again and again to renounce Nazi barbarism. Soon after Roosevelt's death, the hysteria of the already mentioned McCarthy era emerged in America. The shock for my parents and grandparents was the deeper. The entire country was increasingly ruled by a fear of and agitation against communists, by enemy stereotypes, by suspicions, interrogations, and arrests. Fundamental civil rights were being restricted. In retrospect, this was my first example of how vulnerable and unstable the still very young life form of democracy was, even in its Western birthplace, America. My family suffered so greatly from these incisive changes that they were more and more distanced from the US. It is from this period that the sentence by my uncle Thomas Mann originates, written shortly before his death: "Oh, America, my dreamland, my lost dream." I relocated back to Europe with my parents in 1949. 3 years later, my grandparents followed. But my early impressions could not end my glowing American patriotism. I was, as an American by birth, still too inspired by our heroic victory over Nazi Germany to understand the scope of McCarthyism. The sudden geographical separation from the US felt all the worse for me as a 9-year-old. For many years, I suffered from strong homesickness, longing for my lost childhood paradise. Shortly before the end of the Obama era in November 2016, the German federal government was able, under the initiative of then Foreign Minister and now Federal President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, to buy, for quite a significant sum, the former home of my grandparents, Thomas and Katja Mann, in California. The White House of Exile, as the federal president calls the house, has since been fundamentally renovated and transformed into a transatlantic center for encounter and dialogue. As such, it is meant to be a symbol for what it was in the times of Thomas Mann, a space of resistance against dictatorship and totalitarianism, and simultaneously a center for intercontinental exchange for the consolidation of a humane, democratic peace. On the other hand, it is also meant to be an effective sign against the current drifting apart of the transatlantic alliance between the US and Europe. The acquisition and the new use of the house are intended to be an expression of Germany's respect for the great tradition of American democracy. From within, it speaks the wish to stand with the US in their current crisis. The new use of the house is in this sense to be understood as a small greeting of hope and a gift from Germany to the US. After all, Germany primarily has the USA to thank for the slow and steady construction of its now relatively solid democracy after its necessary restart in 1945. This is why the house was also planned to be a place of remembrance of the great preceding epochs of democracy in the United States. In a way, it is also dedicated to the proud leaders such as Benjamin Franklin, Abraham Lincoln, Harriet Tubman, and emigre Thomas Mann's American contemporary Franklin D. Roosevelt. For me personally, the purchase of the house makes apparent the stark difference between Germany today and that of 1945, whose condition I witnessed succinctly from this very house. Who in this house would have even dreamt back then, when Germany lay in ashes, that in 2016 a German government would rescue and buy this house, Thomas Mann's home in exile, and make it into a site for the protection and fortification of democracy and peace. In this sense, the German federal president Frank-Walter Steinmeier has let us know his intentions with a quotation which he wrote especially for you here today in this conference. Atlanticism, he says. Atlanticism was an American creation that saved and protected Europe in unprecedented circumstances. In the currently unfolding global competition, much will depend on Europe to keep Atlanticism alive in the vital interest of both Europe and the United States. Atlanticism will require political wisdom on both sides, irrespective of moments of discord and even rivalry. It will also require a dialogue that enriches people on both sides. We must not become strangers in each other's eyes. So, the Federal President Frank-Walter Steinmeier. Against this background, it was never the intention of the German federal government to use this house only as a memorial to Thomas Mann's literary and political work. Rather, its purpose is to serve as a space of transatlantic dialogue in regards to the future of democracy. And this transatlantic dialogue is not only designed to strengthen the vital solidarity between American and European continent, it is also expected to help break through the speechlessness of today's deeply fractured American society, where fear and despair have robbed many people of the courage and power to feel a sense of community and to live together in solidarity. I am thinking here also about the two traditional political parties of the USA, which in my opinion definitely have to move towards a stronger constructive dialogue with one another than is currently the case. Parties in a democratic country are by definition in competition with one another, but this competition has to remain fair and should not derail into polarizing or even hostile fronts or icy silence. The practice that started at the Thomas Mann House in 2018 has begun to prove that this alternative White House can be a place of encounter in the widest sense. The invited fellows from Germany who stay for a few months are not there for their self-realization as artists or researchers. The reason for their stay is the dialogical exchange through daily togetherness, both with one another and with their American colleagues. Those American counterparts to the fellows from Germany are not only residents of Los Angeles in California. They can come from anywhere on the American continent. They exchange concepts and ideas, communicate, discuss, disagree, and stimulate. It is about friendships and partnerships, joint trips to conferences or cultural and political institutions from coast to coast. They stay, give talks, or hold panel discussions or seminars. They support each other at eye level in the spirit of a transatlantic pluralism of ideas and beliefs. The core idea of this attempted dialogical togetherness is brought to the point with a quote by Jewish philosopher Martin Buber from his programmatic religious text originating from Jewish and Christian mysticism. I and Thou, that's the title. And there he said, all real living is encounter. This means that the identity of the human being never stems solely from itself, but always needs to be viewed in relation to its environment. Only the relation to a human other, the thou, or to the material world of it, make possible a certain demarcation of the I from its life world. Individuality can only be experienced in relationality. Dialogues change us. This is why they should not be primarily oriented towards a definable goal, but remain naturally open. Charles Taylor, a leading American proponent of the political philosophy of communitarianism, expresses this similarly. He says, discovering my own identity doesn't mean that I work it out in isolation, but that I negotiated through dialogue, partly overt, partly internal, with others. The German fellows at the Thomas Mann House are selected by a committee in Germany, but their dialogue partners can, in theory, be any American. All of you, ladies and gentlemen, can join. Because the more dialogue partners spread evenly throughout the USA a fellow can exchange with, the better, the more intensively, lively and diverse will the forms of transatlantic dialogue be. This fortunate project has brought me home in a dual sense. In one way, back to the newly dressed home of my grandparents from my American childhood. On the other hand, back to a long dormant political involvement in the concerns of American politics. Especially now I see myself as an American citizen, democratically shaped by my family. Additionally, the generous decision of the German government to bring this project into existence has retroactively encouraged me in my decision to consciously accept German citizenship, almost 60 years after the war. In this way, I am now also doing my part as a German in this transatlantic project. In Germany, from time to time, I am asked whether I see a real chance for transatlantic dialogue between Germany and the US in times where the administration in Washington questions transatlantic partnerships, not to mention that democracy is not looking particularly good in Europe either, and that Europe itself is on verge of disintegration. And I also often hear that as a result of its progressing weakening and reallocation, the now ancient NATO alliance is finally overdue to be replaced by new coalitions. In the context of this, Russia and China are often mentioned. It may be that some slow changes in this regard have become discernible, but I think it would be futile to already attempt a prognosis. And it seems to me especially futile to speak of an end of the transatlantic alliance, not to mention that I do not take a German involvement in a Russian or Chinese power sphere as particularly attractive prospect. Germany and the US have a tightly joined history since 1945. It consisted for a long time of a conjoined economic and political bloc against the Eastern Hemisphere. However, the most important thing that the slowly rebuilt post-war West Germany has learned from the US, the birthplace of Western democracy, has been so finally construct its own increasingly stable parliamentary democracy. That this most humane and dignified of societal forms has now become endangered on both continents through the accelerating technological and socio-political changes is no reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it is even less reasonable to prematurely engage in new coalitions with states or communities of states whose cultural and political structures are still miles away from a liberal democracy based on the belief of the freedom and autonomy of its citizens. America's democracy, tried and tested, may be at a particularly tense moment, but this is no reason to declare all the US terminated with it. I remember similar predictions from my Aunt Erika already in the late 40s. Back then, Erika Mann was an even more exposed target for McCarthy's witch hunt than her father, Thomas Mann. Then, and also later, she would grate on my 12-year-old ears with the prophecy of doom that America was heading towards a swift demise. She compared it to the downfall of the Roman Empire 1,500 years earlier. If this prophecy had any truth in it, perhaps an American democracy would have never even taken off after the murderous witch trials of Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, or it would have been finished in 1865 without the rescuing initiative of Abraham Lincoln, who repealed the division of the US into southern and northern states. And even the fascistic-like McCarthy era did not turn out to be the end point of American democracy for good reasons. In his speech, Struggle for Democracy, on occasion of the inauguration of the Thomas Mann House at the Getty Center in Los Angeles on June 9th in 2018, Federal President Steinmeier underscored the necessity for the ending of struggle, not only for the preservation of democracy, but also its continual renewal. Because part of human freedom is to be susceptible to weaknesses, predispositions, and temptations which can hinder the development of democracy and which need to be again and again corrected. This is why democracy is never self-evident. Its course is normally marked by alternating highs and lows. Thus, we, co-responsible for the preservation of democracy, need to remain alert. This alertness is aimed mainly at the principal enemies of every democracy: programmatic irrationalism, populism, fundamentalism, and extremism. And so we have to keep an eye on these dangers, also in Germany and Europe, so that democracy there does not plummet into a disaster again, as it did at the time of the Weimar Republic. Democracy is continually in need of a renewal. Everyone who commits their creative ideas to its preservation and renewal can take part in ensuring that democracy also remain able to renew itself. Democracy only has a future in this way, but it remains consistent with human nature, fragile and uncertain. The fragility of democracy is not only due to the flaws of the constituents. The system of democracy also demands constant adjustment to the changing times. Special consideration has to be given to historical contexts hostile to democracy. If, for example, our anachronistic system of the Electoral College, stemming back to the founding period, had to be now being replaced by a more timely system, at least one of our presidents would not have been elected. Despite having to take our fate in our own hands, we, the people, we all share the responsibility of closing the gap between the rich and the poor in America, between city and country, between men and women, especially regarding their access to political positions. We have to make sure that the rights of all people, no matter of the color of their skin or ethnic, religious, and cultural background, are not just codified on paper in our Constitution. They also have to be realized and secured in practice. A precondition for the reduction of the power imbalance between privileged and underprivileged, and for the removal of cliquishness between beneficiaries, is to reduce communicative barriers between the two. For this, it is important to encourage potential conversation partners tirelessly to develop confidence-building dialogical communication. This, in turn, necessitates a fostering of the ability and willingness for dialogue, also in the school and educational system. It is almost proof of the feeling of responsibility of many of our citizens that there is a growing protest culture of people from all social strata and ethnic groups. What impresses me most is the strident and non-violent way in which even children and teenagers make themselves heard. For example, survivors of the recent multiple school massacres in the US which could have easily been prevented with stricter gun legislation, have paid visits to the White House, and they expressed their despair and sorrow for the loss of their classmates and their fear of further attacks. And they demanded, albeit thus far without success, a change in course of the gun lobby, which shares evidently responsibility for the serial killings. This courageous initiative has activated the peers all over the world for the so-called Fridays for Future. It is a student protest movement during school hours every Friday morning against climate change, initiated by a Swedish student, which has been very known now very much. Meantime, it has spread like wildfire everywhere, including in the US. In conclusion, I want to hone in on the deeper levels of interpersonal dialogue, and with it, the human conscience and human will in general. Because in their depths lie our powers which strive for self-determination, autonomy, and freedom, the preconditions of every democracy. However, the mental capacities gifted to us for this do not simply fall into our lap. We have to slowly acquire them by working on ourselves step by step. This is why I bring up the practice of experiential dialogue, as I call it, which might, in my opinion, play an important part in transatlantic dialogue. This experiential dialogue is a special form of dialogue which is practiced between all religions and all kinds of worldviews, the pluralism of which is particularly strong in the US. What is significant about the experiential dialogue is that it exceeds any theological or philosophical discourse to also include the silence of meditation and contemplation and a communal spiritual practice. Originally, it describes dialogues between ordained clerics, nuns, and monks from all global religions. Its specific practice deriving from the vaults of the oldest religious culture and traditions is a process led more by the heart than the head. It enables a deep insight into the understanding of one's own religious or also non-religious roots, and thus strengthens the perception and opening of one's own inner identity. On the other hand, it fosters mutual understanding and values the spiritual and also non-spiritual world of the other within the accepted multiplicity of faiths through a prejudice-free, respectful, and empathic understanding. Through this authentic and relational exchange, the participants can also check the flexibility and malleability of their own inner identity. This constructive synergy of self and us leads to a particular intensity and depth of shared dialogue experience. Let me tell you about an impressive experience as an example. Recently, I participated in a discussion in Berlin, moderated by the German federal president, with a journalist, a theological sociologist, and an Islamic theology scholar about the relationship between religion and democracy. This, in my eyes, particularly authentic and relational exchange between controversial positions sounded to me like an experiential dialogue transposed onto a scientific, theological, and political level. Personal positions were expressed authentically and transparently and progressively deepened, and the concerns of the participants were empathically and appreciatively received and further interrogated. Because it was not a spiritual exchange of experience, an exchange of experience between ordained clerics, but a factual discussion between experts of different fields, the personal religious identity of the participants and the moderator were never explicitly addressed, but it was clearly implicit within all contributions. During the course of the conversation, it became more and more clear to me that I would wish for the transatlantic dialogues between fellows and counterparts at the Thomas Mann House and elsewhere also to take the same form. I even see the example in it for dialogue all over the US, through which we could cultivate a stronger community than thus overcome a climate of alienation, competition, and a dog-eats-dog mentality. After all, as I said, all real living is encounter. In this sense, following my last example, I would like to pose this question. How far could the central principles of interspiritual experiential dialogue be integrated into the more or less factual, even controversial political, scientific, and cultural debates in our countries? Countless experts entrusted with difficult tasks, politicians, unionists, negotiators, seem to be keenly aware that this is beneficial to proceed an anxiously anticipated discussion or situation with a particular inner attunement, a kind of meditative pause, or step back into ourselves in silence. So I occasionally hear from state officials endowed with charismatic leadership skills that in the event of a public announcement of an important decision, they withdraw in silence for half an hour or so before stepping in front of a microphone. They generally tend to prepare themselves in this way also for delicate and decisive negotiations. It is also known that the more people are consolidated in themselves and calm in this fashion, the more they will be ready to engage with an opponent or conflicting party and to take them seriously as an adequate dialogue partner. This way, through an empathetically understanding attitude, they can arrive at a realization of common goals and attempt to solve problems conjointly. This long-term process will over time more and more effectively replace irreconcilable opinions in categories of victory and defeat with conciliation, convergence, complementation, and balance. I think that the most apparent political application of the basic principles of experiential dialogue is diplomacy. Longtime German ambassador in London and Washington, Peter Ammon, said in a recent interview that good diplomacy requires a readiness for self-critique, that diplomacy is never a one-man show but can only be successful through togetherness, and third, also that it requires at least a minimal basis of trust towards your collocutor. Dialogue in interpersonal, international, and intercultural areas is corresponding to our human complexity, a multifaceted, diversely colorful, and highly interesting subject. Ability for dialogue is an irreplaceable condition for our unanimous living together. It is a mental breeding ground for every democracy. And if we assume that democracy, especially in the USA, is most adequate for our modern conception of humanity and most likely to guarantee peaceful coexistence, then this dialogue is an expression of our ability to listen, to understand, and to verbalize, a symbol of human culture and dignity, and in particular, a basis for a mental climate of democracy. Instead, in totalitarianism, the prefabricated dogma of an ideology equipped with sanctions is the brutal instrument of those in power to dominate their people. This ideology excludes dialogue, silences it, prohibits it, so that the totalitarian powers remain in control of the masses. But the basis for a peaceful democracy is dialogue. And the basis for a fruitful dialogue in turn is a consciousness bound to ethical values. And this includes a striving for interpersonal communication and encounter. In this sense, it is of central importance to further develop a conversational culture that unites people and to attempt to realize constructive forms of communication and patterns of attitudes inspired by the experiential dialogue. After all this I have said about the limits and risks, but also the value of democracy, I would like to quote one of the greatest politicians and staunchest defenders and savers of democracy from his famous speech on November 11, 1947 in the House of Commons, Winston Churchill. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And to conclude, once more, from his master's voice, Thomas Mann, in The Coming Victor of Democracy, one sentence. If we say truth, we also say freedom and justice, and if we speak of freedom and justice, we mean truth. It is a complex of an indivisible kind, freighted with spirituality and an elementary dynamic force. We call it the absolute. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Frido Mann. I think you have done such a beautiful job of weaving your family history and your influences from childhood on into the whole story of what democracy is and how democracy can be maintained and nurtured. Trust, self-critique, working together. One might also add just simply reason. All these values that you have been so imbued with. Frido has kindly offered to take questions. Frido, would you like me to moderate, or would you like to just come up here and do that? Okay. Go ahead. And if anyone who has questions can just stand here for my
Sure.
And there's one over there as well.
Thank you very much for your comments. I would hope that Thomas Mann and his Centers for Democratic Thought might become as well known as and widespread going forward 100 years as the Goethe Institute has been in the post-war period. It would be my deep hope as a Democrat and a cultured person that there could be Thomas Mann centers and also that the problems between, I know there are Confucius centers that are being developed by the Chinese government with their newfound wealth, but I would hope Russia, the Russian Federation would have the wisdom to develop Pushkin centers around the world and that there could be. But my question is, You've talked about the Pacific Palisades Center for Transatlantic Dialogue, and you've talked about international or intercultural dialogue and events taking place in Berlin. Do you and the German government and the other people involved in this new movement for the Thomas Mann House and associated dialogues, do you have any strategy for using the Pacific Palisades campus for transatlantic dialogue and using the Berlin Center for international and intercultural dialogue and interreligious too?
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is, of course, a long-term goal. The work of the house now is a little more than 1 year old. It was opened in 2018, and we are at the beginning, and we have had several very good fellows there. Sorry, yeah. Maybe so. Okay, how can I read again? So the house there is very new, which now it has been opened in June 2018, and the goals we have is still are very long term, and it takes a long time. But my long term wish really would be in a strategy. I'm very many times there also in the house, and I will also in a week will visit the house again. But even if it would be very nice to have communication with other centers, I think it's even more important that also the structures of a transatlantic dialogue should fasten in that way that other centers, not Thomas Mann centers, other centers. Berlin is one that's very not, and in Berlin I also am thinking of the American Academy. There is also one. This would be very important. There is not very strong relationship now, but this company. But now when I was beginning my lecture tour in America, I began with the German Academy. The German Academy in New York is on the Fifth Avenue. This is the former Goethe Institute. Goethe moved out a few years ago, and now there is an academy, a German academy, beginning its work. It's called 1014 because it's the house number, and it has to, because the house has to be now in the next 2 years, has to be renewed and very new, with very high German financiation. That's they get the foreign ministry gave much money for that, so in 2 years maybe they will begin their work, and I think it would be very important to have a real network, a real systematic network of different houses, different institutions, Thomas Mann or not Thomas Mann, but they all have the same spirit. And that's the important thing. And this could help to strengthen and to fortify, to have a fortification of the transatlantic dialogue, and with the dialogue then also with democratic structures, which are very important. I mean, I'm very happy that now I was talking about the weaknesses of the European democracy. That's what I said when I wrote this lecture. But now in the last weeks and days, even, I'm very happy that what happened now in Europe too, in Italy and in Austria and England and so. So I'm getting a little more optimistic. But still, what we have to really do is dialogue between different institutions with their own structures they have, communicate, exchange, and that's what I would say. So I would really say, as you were asked before, this is the line we have to follow.
I was going to share with you that I feel perhaps a little bit like your aunt during McCarthyism these days. So we all look back on our history from the United States and realize that it has survived as a very successful democracy. But some of the principles that you spoke of that ensure we maintain a democracy in terms of dialogue and in terms of people dealing with facts, openness, and respect for each other's opinion, some of those are more challenged these days, at least in my opinion, especially the issue of facts. And so I guess I just was wondering if you could address that situation here in the United States with that perspective, you know, that some of the critical components to maintain democracy, which are facts, openness, and honest exchange, are a bit challenged. Thank you.
Yeah, also have to admit that, I mean, it's already, I'm now since 10 days, I'm now traveling through America. It's still the beginning. Altogether, I will be 6 weeks traveling. But I already have, I don't want to mention the name of the city I was, but there it happened. I was trying to have a talk with pupils from a high school. And the gentleman who was inviting me, he phoned with many school directors and asked if I could come. And so very different from what I experienced yesterday. Wonderful experience now here in Washington with the high school. There, all the directors they said it's not possible. The polarization in our country is so big between the parents of the kids and the kids themselves that would bring so many trouble into the structure of our school. Please don't come and talk about democracy with our kids. This is reality, and this is a reality in the U.S. But I say always, U.S. as a whole doesn't exist anymore. There are a few parts of the U.S. who are very, very different. And my hope is that the strong parts of the USA and the strong East Coast, West Coast, everybody knows this, and other parts too, will have some influence on the other parts too sometime. Not now in the coming presidential election, but maybe afterwards. I'm sure after this long time of survival of the democracy, this also will somehow, it must. I don't think that the democracy in America is finished. Not at all. But it's a great struggle. And I said also before, I'm not so much an optimist, but I'm struggling. And the struggling is the only way how you can come over all these troubles who are there, also between the parties. And it's a long, long process, and I just can make a small little contribution, but I want to do this. And I hope that also many other people, I can communicate with them, and we can build up a little network. But that's the reality. Reality, it is very, it's endangered, and it's quite much work to do. That's better I cannot say.
Dieter Detke at Georgetown University. I'm grateful to you for, in spite of everything, keeping up an optimistic view of a transatlantic dialogue that works, to support democracy, and in spite of everything. And what I wanted to ask you is, if you look around, and I would like to appeal to your psychological knowledge and wisdom, so to speak. Talk about leadership, because for dialogue, you need leaders, right? And look around. Here in the United States, you have clearly a tendency to a populist authoritarianism. Is that a word we could use, maybe? Look at Germany, and I would say there is a strange vacuum of leadership, right? Angela Merkel is on the way out. We don't know what's going to happen. There's a vacuum. Look at Europe. Sure, there's Macron, but look at the European Union and the struggle for leadership and capacity to live up to Europe's ambitions. They used a German word for that ambition, which is Weltpolitikfähigkeit. And to deliver that is so hard that I doubt a little bit that we can remain as optimistic as you are. So I would like you to address the issue of leadership to maintain, the prospects and the success of democracy, given all the dangers that come up. Yeah. I mean, look around what populism can do in Europe and here. So can you talk about the leadership qualities and issues that we need in order to succeed?
Yeah. I would say a half a year before, I would just say the same thing what you are now saying. And but now, just as I think I mentioned it shortly, since a few months, things have changed in Europe for me. It's not in Germany, for instance. Not only Merkel has a leadership quality. Also, the federal president Steinmeier. He did not only buy the house and open it. He makes many important speeches. He goes to the countries where the Nazis had committed crimes and talks to the people, and he's doing all the time, really, almost every day, something for his nation as a authority. Really is. That's one thing. There are also other politicians in Germany. For instance, I'm very happy that Ursula von der Leyen, who was a minister in Germany, now is a leader in the whole Europe, and I think she has a real strong authority to also to help that Europe doesn't fall apart. Then we have, since the day before yesterday, Sunday, in the elections in Austria, we have a new president, a young man, a very dynamic man, who for some months were just shut away, but now he's back. And now he has a better possibility to make coalitions with other parties than he had before with the right-wing people. The Green people are strong. So Italy happened what happened there. That right-wing they fell out because the chief of the whole government stepped out, and the president. He said, okay, then we change the cards now totally, and then the socialists and the other party, I think the Five-Star Party, something, they came together now with a good government. We don't know how long it will rest, but it did. So that populism and nationalism, where we have to really be afraid. Also in Germany, you didn't mention the right-wing party AfD, which in the countryside in the east is quite dangerous. But still, democracy in Germany is so strong that we can control them. They until now they remain controlled. So it's just the last happenings, I would say, what have been now in the last. They are really much better than, and I really didn't expect them, but they happened. It was so, and this gives me some courage. Not to be optimistic. I tell again, it's not optimism. It's I have the. Really the will of struggling, and it gives me more courage to struggle more. That's all.
If I may, I was very excited to hear what kind of role you ascribe to dialogue, because that's, of course, the Goethe Institute is based on dialogue. I've always dealt with it. I wrote my dissertation on dialogue theory, especially that you quoted Martin Buber. And Ich und Du, I and Thou. So as a psychologist, how far would you go when it comes to dialogue? Is dialogue something we need to get along, or is dialogue something that goes much farther and is sort of at the center of what once used to be called identity, something that we don't exist without, something that makes us? So if that is true, and I assume it is, doesn't that mean that we cannot really exist, we are not really human beings if we are not engaged in a dialogue? So doesn't follow from that a very, very fundamental function of dialogue? And isn't it something that we don't always have to stress? It shouldn't be such a necessity. So why is it that?
Yeah, I think the dialogue is, or the capacity for the dialogue is a process. It never stops. One never can be happy with that. One really happy with that. But one got now to function. But it also have to overthink what one achieved. But I think what you mentioned is that what's very important, that the deepness of the ability to make dialogues. So it's not from a psychological viewpoint that I'm saying this. I was a psychologist, but I began after my first music studies. I was a theologian, and I think this is more the point. And already in my second semester, I wrote a paper about Martin Buber, and I was very proud of it, that it was that it went so well. And now, somehow coming back to my theological roots, I am also working together with, it's not a monastery, but it's a union of people who invite theologians and monks and nuns from all religions at making inter-monastic and inter-spiritual dialogues for a few days. They live together, they read texts, they go in silence, of course, they cook together, everything. And then they go home again. And then the next things come. And also in different places. And there, as I already said, you can learn that from the old traditions. It's not the Christian religions, it's even more the Asian religions, the old traditions, the Hindus, and other Asian religions. There you can really learn what is deepness is of identity, of looking on its own convictions, to find them, to stay with them, and it's also a wisdom from these old religions that the more you are with yourself, the more you seem to be. You close yourself from the outside. The more you have the possibility to open in your environment what before you didn't do. And this is the central, I think, the central topic of a dialogue. What we should do. Not only dialogue is not a technique. It can be a technique. There are several psychological ways to teach techniques. That's true. That's okay. But that's not the main thing. The main thing is really the opinion, the attitude, and the working on oneself, and do it if you do it in groups, and if you learn from others, from these old people, from these old monks, and you can really learn much from them for political discussions, for dialogue in a very non-religious way. So, and that's why I'm thankful that you are mentioning this. I can repeat this again what I tried also to say. Yeah.
Mr. Mann, you talked about the necessity of dialogue, but if you look at this country, and you talked about different parts of this country already, that it's not one country anymore, people are not in dialogue anymore. People don't talk to each other. They don't, in families, you see people not able to talk about their political issues or their values that differ. So what is there to do if people are not willing to engage in dialogue? It sounds so good and it sounds so optimistic, but what is there to do?
I think that the fact that there are cities or communities where dialogue do function in America. Nobody can say that dialogue is dead in the whole America. That's not the fact. The fact is that there are regions, that there are places. I just told you the story about the teachers who didn't let me talk with the children. There is no dialogue. That's clear. That's speechlessness, and that's silence. And silence is always the beginning of something very evil. We know that from history. But still, I think these places, these oases, or these places where it does function, and there are places in America, I think, for instance, Washington, where I'm now, and where I had yesterday in that school. That was a great experience with these kids, with whom I could talk about that. I told them what I think about democracy. Then there was the points was written on the board, and then the children were divided into small groups, and they talked about this, also about dialogues, and then they gave their comments, and then at the end we had some results. No? That's just a tiny little example, but I think where these examples are in a broad way possible to develop, there is a possibility that these strong parts of America can they have to try to go into these places and try to make a dialogue. If I would have been stayed longer in that city, I would have gone to these teachers themselves. I couldn't. 2 days later, I was gone and continuing travel to here or some another place. But I think people who have time should do this, and I'm sure that there must be a possibility to begin somewhere. I wouldn't just withdraw and say now everything is now. What shall we do? It's all finished. I don't think this. I'm just convinced that there is a possibility. There is some potential things here. There's some possibility here. More I cannot say. That's all. I don't know if it's an answer to your question, but it's.
The question is to concentrate on the parts where it already functions, or
Yeah.
to concentrate on the parts where it's not functioning?
Both. Coming first at the place where it functions, then go out, and then go out.
First of all, grüezi. And the last few years of my life, as it so happened, I went to school in Lübeck at the Thomas Mann School, and I have got very strong impressions from my time there. But my question would be of how to address, I guess, the silent people and the agnostics, not in a religious sense, but whenever there has been open debate, I've seen many people who are either afraid of their own opinions or just rather sit there, or even just walk out if something they said that they don't like or they have no clue. And sometimes these are even forced onto the stage and people ask them, well, what is your opinion? And if they don't have one, it's like, well, you must say something. And my question is how best to either have these people, should they be more or less educated or be talked to them until they finally make their opinion on their own, or should you let them develop their own way or let them find the courage to speak in due time on their own?
I think there's no a way where you have to do this way or this way. I think there are many possibilities. Partly wait, partly talk with them, partly try to influence them, find friends for them to talk with them, so that bring them together. I think some creative way of making dialogue possible must be, of course, it must be. There is no technique where you have to say this or to do this. I'm sure about this. I mean, I don't know the situation. I must have to hear what it really was happened, then I could see. But anyway, there is no way. It has to go like this way and not this way. That's all.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Well, then I will say thank you, Frido Mann, for a wonderful